Okay, hi everyone. So you can see here that we're on a split screen, and I just want to give you some ideas about how to work your way through talking about literature. We're obviously going to be writing about a great deal of literature. So I have some helpful links and some sites that I've listed. The one that I'm going to go through quickly and sort of explain in my own words is probably my favorite one. And then you can apply these to if you're someone who reads literature on a, daily basis, that's great. If you're someone who hasn't read these short stories ever or in quite some time, even if you need a refresher, it doesn't matter. I want this to be a way where you can open up discussion, know what to look for in these stories. It's fine to say, I like this, I don't like this, but that's not enough to justify what we call a literary analysis. And that is a true breakdown of what you're reading, a true breakdown of the text. So I'm going to switch off here in a second to looking at just the screen. So you should see in 1 minute here that I'm going to flip to. What's on your screen right now is how to discuss literature. And I've linked to this on our Moodle page, but I want you to, you should be able to see all of this right now. I should be hidden in your view, hopefully. This is how to discuss literature. It's one of the best sort of sites I found with this. And so, this is a gen ed course. This is a 200 level course. And so I want it to be a way for all of you to, get some reading in because I know it's so hard to actually get reading in during the semester. You rarely get to read anything for fun. And we have only a very brief time together this summer. We only have about 6 weeks and they go by extremely fast. So I always tell someone first, if you read a story and you have no idea where you should start commenting and talking about it, you can pick a point that says sort of, are there any parts of the story that make me say, this is cool, or this reminds me of something, or this is significant and why, or I liked this, or I was shocked by this, or this made me angry, this made me sad, etc. So you can always kind of start with that perspective. You can also start in talking about like a turning point. You can say, gosh, it was this particular moment. Often we talk about that in like TV shows, and we talk about that sort of in movies. We say we immediately tend to go towards one moment that stands out to us and that we remember. You can kind of do the same thing with that in terms of talking about books. So if we're talking about literary criticism, if we're talking about what I just mentioned and talking literary analysis, that term might sound super fancy and it might sound really kind of out there. But really, to analyze something needs to break down. So when we're performing and writing a literary analysis, we're breaking down literary text. This talks about, as the website here says, analyzing, really important, relating, and discussing. So you're breaking the story into separate pieces. These are all short stories that we're reading, so you can imagine as you're reading novels and breaking them down, that takes quite a bit more time. You can analyze a story from characters. Sometimes we have some really cool, we have some very interesting, unique, hard to read characters. You can talk about the author. You can talk about major and minor themes. You can talk about what's great to relate to today's social issues. You can talk about rhythm and timing and images or symbols, cultural influence, conflicts. As the website says here, and as I would say to you, the choices are endless. And then after you pick out and start to come up with some things that you want to talk about, you relate the pieces to one another. So how does one part go with the next? How does the beginning go to the middle to the end? How are the characters given perspective? What insights does this give you into conflict, into life? And then, this is the biggest part, discussing the work. Because it only goes so far and it only stops to say, well, I can read this for myself and come up with my own clues. But you often at times are way more keyed into a story, and you're way more into a story when you yourself can discuss it with other people. I know sometimes I read a story one way and someone else reads it an entirely different way. The best thing about literature is saying that, well, neither of the two people are completely wrong. However, it is very interesting because other people can bring in perspectives that you did not know about. This does not mean critiquing. This is not saying like, oh my goodness, that writer was horrible, or this is not saying, gosh, how did they get this published? So it's much more than just good, bad, right, and wrong. You can say that the author wrote, this character really well, and then go on to explain why. You can say that the author did a really nice job of giving these points or these themes, and you can say why. But we're not here to critique. And a few of the elements of literature that we often discuss, and we will in this class, I won't go through every single one here. Some of these I know are going to pop out at you, and you will say, yes, I do this all the time. I recognize these. But of course, we look for themes. We look for sort of the big overarching picture, what helps us, kind of pull that together. These themes can be very specific. They can be very general, such as looking at gender or race and feminism. And so we try to make things as specific as possible. One of my favorite parts to look at in a story is the characters, or sometimes the lack of characters. You want to look at what here we'll go back and talk about later on, intrinsic features and developmental features. So intrinsic ones are things that don't change: courage, conviction, humility. The ones that are developmental are the ones that can deal with the past, the present, and future. So talking about psychological effects, protagonists, and sort of that way. I like to look at different types of characters that you'll come up with. Some of these, again, dynamic, someone who goes under a really important change. Static is someone who doesn't change. A stock character, you can kind of remember hearing this from sort of like TV shows and movies, something very stereotypical, heavy on like cultural types, doesn't really change very much. Flat is, I hate to say boring, but really no depth or complexity. And round is the opposite, having a lot of depth and complexity to them. You want to think about how your characters change over time. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes that includes different shifts in lifestyle and perspective. And that's a really interesting part to kind of look at. You want to talk about catharsis, and in literature, this means sort of an emotional transformation that the character experiences, or perhaps even by the reader, so you might identify with a character going through as well. And you might have done this already and not even realize the literary term for it. And finally, setting. How does a story setting provide and really look at the exploration of the themes? Setting is really cool to talk about and think about a little bit more. Why is this story set here? For what reason? For what purpose? What does that kind of have to do with the story? There can be different layers of setting, as they say here. You can have sort of different parts that kind of come up with that. Changes in setting. And then, of course, what we want to keep in mind is the plot, like what's actually happening in the story. What background knowledge do we need? What's the rising action? Is there a conflict? Is that conflict internal or external? What's the climax like? What's sort of this big turning point in action? We always look for that in movies and TV shows as well. And then the opposite of that, what is the falling action that leads to the denouement or the final resolution? We will also be talking about narrative point of view. So the story itself determines whose perspective that it's told. Is it first person? So the author, the narrator is using that personal pronoun I or me or myself. You might have second person. The author addresses the reader as you, sometimes uses the words we and us. And finally, third person, from using only he, she, or it. We do not use first or second person in that. Other parts of sort of the analysis that I want you to look at, you'll look for similes, anything that's comparable to something else. Typically, you remember these from your grade school days, like and as. We're constantly looking for different types of metaphor, okay? Reference to something as actually being something else. This is huge in literature, along with personification, is giving those living characteristics and personality to non-living things. Some of my other favorite parts that you might be able to pick out in some of the stories, particularly maybe some of the over-the-top or very magical realist ones that we look at, is anthropomorphism. And this is when you have personification that applies to human characteristics, to animals or objects. It's very fun to point out. Other things that we'll look for, irony, of course. Sometimes you have irony that's that opposition between two different ideas, events, perspectives. Is it verbal? Is it spoken? Is it like the situation itself? Or perhaps it presents itself with what we call dramatic irony. Symbolism is any object, person, place, or action that has meaning while it represents sort of two things at once. So we want to constantly look for that. An archetype is similar to a theme. invisible presences that only reveal themselves through symbols or very symbolic events. You also want to think about the author's influences, the way that their own background and history, personality has affected their work, because often at times learning a little bit more about the author's background can help you understand their way of writing, their style of writing, and why they wrote the story in general. Now, I won't go through all these now. I will go through these definitely probably at the end of this week as you start to write your first paper. But there are some rules about writing about literature. We always want to write in the present tense because these stories, they're all fiction stories. They've all happened. They're happening in their own sort of world itself. They've never happened in real life. If you were writing about a nonfiction event, person, place, then you would use the past tense because something already did happen in the past. We always write in third person unless I say it's okay to use I and put in your own perspective with that. You want to be the most objective. And then, of course, I want you to read through, and I'll post way more resources to help you. We're following MLA style in this class, so citations are really, really important. We both use in-text citations in the body of the paper, author, last name, and page number. Whenever you're quoting, paraphrasing, or using anything that is a reference from summarizing from the actual text itself. My general rule is when in doubt, cite. And then, of course, you would have a works cited page to match all the in-text citations. Don't worry about that. I promise to go over that much more in depth. I just wanted to, at this point, I'm going to flip back to our two modes here, give you a little bit about writing and reading about literature. As you can see, you can find these right here on the Moodle page. Notes on reading literature. And I'm slowly starting to add the rest of your questions and materials for this week. So please make sure to go through everything thoroughly and mark down any questions that you have. Every week you have here with the start materials, you have what to do and what to read. So your stories for this week and anything extra included. And you will always see all of that listed above in your grid format here. I also want to refer you to the water cooler discussion board, also a great place for general questions. So please tune in to the rest of the notes and materials, and we'll talk about those and all the great stories that we have that will certainly come up in the near future.